So for this episode, I wanted to go back a little and do a review of a manga, or in this case, Gekiga. Gekiga is not considered manga, even though it is printed in manga format. Gekiga is a form of Japanese comic, but it focuses more on adult themes, slice of life. And no, I don't mean hentai, actual slice of life, like real life. And it doesn't have the same entertainment values of manga, which usually includes things like action, adventure, comedy, romance, things like that. Anything whimsical. Gekiga instead looks at the real life and tells more dramatic stories aimed at a much more mature or adult audience. Gekiga came about in the early 1950s and was actually coined by the artist Yoshihiro Tatsumi, who is thought to be the originator of Gekiga, and actually he is the author whose work I am reviewing today. Yoshihiro Tatsumi was born in June of 1935 and just recently passed away in March of this year of cancer. He was one of the many starving comic book artists of that generation who actually lived through and could remember what life was like during World War II. Obviously, this shaped his work greatly, but interestingly, it wasn't the topic that garnered him his attention on a national level. Like many artists his age and during the 50s and through the late 60s, he wrote and drew many works that were used as rental books. Just to give you an idea, rental books was where an artist could create a manga, but the publisher would print just enough copies to send it to stores to be rented out for a fee, kind of like renting a movie. So it wasn't really getting your book published, it was just getting something on paper published to be rented out over and over and over again. Sadly, much of his work in this phase of his life, of his professional life, has been lost. Tatsumi was one of the few artists to rise out of this arrangement and to be published in magazines where royalties, of course, were greater, and eventually had his entire books published. It was at this time, during the late 60s and early 70s, that he created the Gekiga style and came to national attention. In the early 2000s, Drawn and Quarterly, a publishing house, published his work in volumes in book form, where they would choose his best work out of each year during this period of the late 60s and early 70s. And the volume I read recently is from 1971 to 1972, and it is called Goodbye. This volume gives the reader a pretty good idea of what Japan looked like in the early 70s. As noted before, World War II and the dropping of 2 nuclear bombs are huge influences in the work of many artists. However, Tatsumi seems to take it a little bit further as only a backdrop to what he considered to be the more important stories. The stories themselves in Goodbye are incredibly dark and bleak. Keep in mind, while Japan was starting to recover economically at that moment in the early 70s, it would actually still be quite a few years before it would become the economic powerhouse that it would be. At that time, in the 70s, there was high unemployment, homelessness, squalor, slums, and the repression, most importantly, the repression of the individual for the greater good of the country. This is a very current thing that goes through his work. In Goodbye, Tatsumi explores these themes, and to say that the stories are depressing would be an understatement. But at the same time, they are thoughtful and vibrant. None of the stories really end with a Disney ending, and instead leaves the character with a sense of helplessness and despair for the characters that are involved. These characters never really win in life and are full of regret and sometimes self-loathing. There are stories involving men just entering into retirement and their feelings of uselessness in life, marriage, and sex. There are dilemmas of those who thought they were acting nobly but were in fact being used or played the entire time. And there is, in particular, a story about an older man who has done well for himself financially but maintains a facade of philanthropic service to hide his lust for women in boots. The dream sequence of this particular story is very disturbing. I do recommend checking out Goodbye, but understand that the style is really not for your average manga reader. You have to have a certain level of maturity for this work and be ready to be incredibly depressed. In fact, you may want to have something like Cromartie High School to cheer you up after reading this book.